All right, it looks like we are live. Welcome. So, I am planning on having a discussion with Matt Slick, the founder of the Christian Apologetics and Research Ministry, carm.org. It was supposed to be tomorrow on Striving for Eternity's channel, but it looks like there is a conflict there. Um, so, we'll probably have to change channels or change his time. I'm trying to get a hold of Matt Slick. I'm sorry. I am having a hard time hearing.
I didn't say anything, no.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, so I'm trying to get a hold of Matt Slick to try and pin down the exact date and time. But so far, I have not been able to hear back from him, or I've not been able to hear back from Dr. Anthony Silvestro either. Thank you for volunteering to come in and help with the preparation. I put a link in the sidebar chat if anyone else wants to come on and help me prepare for our discussion with Matt Slick. I've reviewed a couple of his debates, such as the one with Mr. Dan Barker, and from my interactions with him, he seems to use the same arguments in every debate. Kind of go through the tag, the moral arguments, and a couple others that he uses all the time. So, yeah, thank you, Dressel, for coming in.
That's no problem. And just out of curiosity, that Dan Barker debate that you're talking about, what show was that on?
I'm not sure. It was not actually a show, but it was actually kind of in a like a public live debate in front of a live audience.
Okay. I was just curious because Dan Barker and Matt Slick, they debated before on the Infidel Guys show, and this is going back like 10 years ago, and I scheduled that debate for them. I haven't heard Matt Slick's name in years, so I was surprised when you brought him up. I didn't even realize that he was still trucking.
Oh yeah, he has. He's still doing his radio show, and he has a carm.org Discord server now, and he still does chats in there, apologetics debates, and he's also in a couple other servers on Discord. I'm pretty sure that they just stopped using Pal Talk altogether because Pal Talk is a complete dumpster fire. Hey, Standing for Truth, it's good to see you, my man. Thank you for stopping in. I see you're doing a stream in a few minutes. I do appreciate you stopping by. Good to see you, my friend.
That's FT.
Yep. Always coming in to see people coming in the streams. Good to see you guys. So with that, let's get started. So I am going to go to carm.org/atheism and going to share my screen in a few minutes. Arguments for the existence of God. So how familiar are you with Matt Slick's arguments? Because he's definitely a precept guy.
Yeah, I'm really familiar with presuppositionalism, and basically things like the moral argument, where logic comes from, the uniformity of the laws that gives rise to science, all that stuff. You trace it back to Abraham Kuyper, the first Calvinist who really started to stress the idea of Christianity or Calvinism being a comprehensive worldview. So basically what I wanted to do for you was I wanted to hear the things that you wanted to present in the debate, and then I wanted to kind of help you evaluate your position, as well as kind of throwing at you the different arguments that I think Matt Slick will basically give your way.
Oh yeah, definitely. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to probably use the same PowerPoint that I used for my discussion with Smoky Saints. I'm going to do that. Let me present my arguments first, I guess, and go from there. Sure. So let us begin. Slideshow. Play from start. Here we go. naturalism and theism. So naturalism versus theism. So let's lay out the different worldviews. Naturalism is a view that the natural world is all that exists, that this natural world is governed by natural laws which have been being discovered by science, and the scientific method is the best method to objectively determine reality. Theism says that in addition to the natural world, there is God in the supernatural world, that this God has various characteristics such as being all powerful, all knowing, all loving, all present, etc. That this God can interact with the natural world and perform miracles. And we should consider the superior worldview is the one that best explains our observations and our reality. So there are two main points that I want to bring up. Number one is that theism is incoherent, and number two, that naturalism is a better model of our reality. Theism is here. First point that there is no agreed upon definition of God, and that the properties of God are incompatible, contradictory. No agreed upon definition of God. What does the word God even mean? How do we know the mind, the will, and the nature of God? And how do we know which religion is correct and what interpretation of that religion is incorrect? Is correct? First, let's look at the contradiction before being all knowing and all powerful. If God exists, then he is omniscient. If God exists, he is free. An omniscient being must know exactly what actions he will and will not do in the future. If one knows what that he will do in action, then it is impossible for him not to do it. And if one knows that he will not do it in action, then it is impossible for him not to do it. Thus, whatever an omniscient being does, he must do it, and whatever he does not do, he cannot do. To be free requires having options open, which means having the ability to act contrary to the way one actually acts. So if one is free, then he does not have to do what he actually does, and he is able to do things that he does not actually do. Hence, it is impossible for an omniscient being to be free, and thus impossible for God to exist. Dan Barker would call this the FANG argument, the free will argument for the non existence of God. Next, naturalism is a better model of our reality. So, what type of stuff would we expect under naturalism? Under natural model, we would expect that all natural phenomena would have a natural cause or explanation. That the universe and Earth must be old. That life would evolve slowly over billions of years, and religions would evolve based on culture, and that the universe would have to be big. And that is exactly what we see. I'll probably elaborate a little bit more later on, but those are kind of the basic outline of what I'm going to present for Matt Slick.
That's a nice, succinct opening. I like that you're using the argument concentrating on omniscience. That should be fun. He's probably going to dive right into Molinism and the whole idea that God can be free and know your free actions and still know the future. So if you're not familiar with Molinism, you might want to check that out a little.
Actually, Matt Slick has published several articles against Molinism.
No shit. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me tone down my sailor tongue.
I don't give a shit. I fucking curse all the time, so feel free to curse.
Cool. Yeah, I didn't know that about him. So what would be his position if it's not going to be Molinism? Does he think that like God acts necessarily or something like that?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure exactly. Here is his. I'm going to share my screen real quick, and I'm actually surprised that Matt Slick is against Molinism, but here's basically what he says. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit. Based upon these four reasons, I must conclude that Molinism is not biblical and shall be rejected. It does not properly represent God's eternal independence and non-contingency in his nature as well as his knowledge. It fails to properly represent man's depraved nature and enslavement to sin, and implies that God shows partiality based on foreseen good choices made by people and create a world based in part on those foreseen choices, and fails to properly deal with why one person chooses God and another doesn't, and a Molinist libertarian position. So that is Matt Slick's position on Molinism.
So yeah, it looks like he must really go pretty much all the way into the Reformed position. Okay, that's fair enough. So I mean, like with this, what I wanted to get into then are some of the arguments that he's going to use. And actually, let me think here for a second, because there were other things. Like, for example, he would say, in regards to your claims about defining God, knowing God's nature, knowing what he wants and what he'll do, that you can go to Revelation for that, and that you can also infer certain characteristics of God based on his creation. So, like when William Lane Craig argues, for example, that it must be a mind, only a mind could be causally efficacious enough to produce a universe like this, and it must be extremely powerful. He must be very knowing and all that stuff. So, you can infer certain properties about God from his creation. I think that would be one of his responses.
Yeah. And I think that's a pretty decent reply. But the problem gets in when you get into like the tag argument and the moral arguments, that I think it begs too many questions, and that it is basically a circular argument.
Okay. So how do you account for something like science then? How do you account for the fact that there's regularity and law in the way that the universe operates? Without that, you couldn't have science to begin with.
Sure. So I would respond that the laws of logic and stuff like that, they are descriptions of reality. They are descriptive. And same way with the laws of nature. They are descriptive. We describe mathematically how things work. And that's simply the way things are.
Okay, I'm going to press you a little bit more on that. Why are they that way? Like, why is it that we have a system of nature that works in a predictable manner? Why isn't it more chaotic? Why do these laws emerge? Is my question.
Sure. So then I will probably respond by saying, okay, after the Big Bang, shortly after we had the era of recombination and the four fundamental forces in nature emerging after that, that govern our physical reality.
Okay. With respect to the laws of logic, one argument, I'm not sure if he uses this, but I mean, it's really popular nowadays, is the evolutionary argument against naturalism that comes from Alvin Plantinga. So basically, the idea being that if it's true, if evolution by natural selection is true, then that means that you've been shaped according to what best promotes reproduction or reproductive success, rather than any acknowledgement of the way that the world truly is. So, how is it that you feel that you can even trust your cognitive abilities to yield true conclusions about the world if your model for coming up with, if your model for understanding it is based on a mechanism that isn't oriented toward truth? It's just oriented toward reproductive success.
Sure. So again, I would say maybe something like, okay, well, science tells us the way things are, not the way that things ought to be. And I would say that, okay, we can check kind of like a little bit of fact checking of our reality based upon our own our observations and mathematics. So,
Okay.
what would you say would be the best way of responding to that?
I'm sorry. Repeat that the last question again.
Oh, I said, how would you respond to that argument?
Okay, so I mean, like when you're responding in that way, basically pointing out that we can do things like observe or maybe think it over, stuff like that. That's exactly the thing that he's trying to criticize. Why do you trust your observations? Why trust your sensory perception? All of this is the result of natural selection, which has absolutely nothing to do with truth and everything to do with reproductive success. And so, I mean, like in terms of where I come from on this, I would stress the connection between natural selection and the truth. Natural selection rewards or punishes organisms upon the basis of how well they're able to react to their environment. If you don't have organisms acting in such a way that they're able to recognize the way that their environment actually is, in the long term, that's a recipe for extinction. Natural selection would reward then people for understanding the true way that the world really is, would be how I would approach that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So we can trust our brain, we can trust our thoughts, we can trust our mind, because if we wouldn't, we'd all be extinct.
Yep. Yeah, I would argue that that's a reasonable position to take based on the way that natural selection works. To get in on the moral side of the argument, then, how do you account for morality? I mean, was Hitler wrong when he burned millions of Jews in his crematories? And if he was, then why?
Sure. So I would use kind of like the harm principle for all of that. Um, and then again, I would go back to natural selection um, and that argument that is society that does all these things um, would be is a recipe for extinction. I would respond to the moral argument by pointing out that it is circular in begging the question. He says that morality is good based upon nature, God's nature, but this is begging the question, and it's quite circular. Um, Basically, we have an action that is good because it is a good an action is good or wrong because of the nature of God, and the nature of God is good for what reason? Why do we know? How do we know the nature of God? How can we objectively determine that? Anyone can come along and say that the nature of God says homosexuality is morally permissible, so and justify it that way. It is simply, I think, kind of like an appeal to. Um, what was that?
Oh, nothing. I was just listening.
Okay, sure. So, yeah, I would kind of point out the circle. Action X is right or wrong based upon God's nature. God's nature is good because God's nature is good, which is completely circular.
Yeah, that's a decent hit, I think, because when they start like people like Bill Craig and all of his acolytes, the way that they handle the situation is that they want to use God as the example of like the greatest moral exemplar, but at the same time, he's a grounding for morality. And when they do this, they kind of like conflate the two a lot of the time when they're trying to ground their morality. So the way that they usually respond is, you're right. They say that that morality is grounded in God's nature, and they would deny that God's nature could be any different, because that's usually the way that skeptics will respond to that. Okay, well, you're saying that morality is based on God's nature. Well, what if God's nature was different? Wouldn't it follow then that morality is different? And
Right.
morality can't be different because these are necessary facts, and so you can't ground it on God's nature. And so then they turn around and they say that God's nature is necessarily the way it is. So uh, in terms of this, my own personal take on this is I tend to, I mean, like, go for it. Use the Euthyphro dilemma if that's what you really want to do. It is an interesting argument. My problem with basically any kind of theistically based ethic is that I think it has problems with the is-ought dilemma. That's a major problem with respect to like any kind of moral realist approach to ethics or meta ethics, and so you have to be able to come up with a theory that successfully bridges is and ought. And I don't think that theistic theories of morality do a very good job at that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I might try and press him on um, reading a couple verses for the Quran and see if he thinks that these are good bad verses or bad verses, and then maybe say, okay, but the Bible says the same exact thing as the Quran, so you can kind of try and pin in that on him. Is it possible for God to command immoral deeds such as rape or murder or anything like that? If God tells you to commit genocide, would you do it? These are the things that I kind of want to press him on.
Yep, that should be fun. He'll probably say that insofar as you like come up with verses in the Quran that agree with the Bible, he'll just agree with them and say that ultimately Islam or any other kind of non-Christian system, in order to come up with factually true ethical statements, that it all ultimately just hinges on Christianity, and that you can't make sense of it outside of Christianity, the
Right.
impossibility of the contrary, and all that. Okay. All right. So we covered logic there. We covered some morality. We covered science and uniformity. So that gets tag out of the way. What about certain other arguments that he might use? These days, is he using much on like the resurrection apologetics? Does he do that at all?
I'm not sure, but he might try and go there. That might well have a pretty good argument against it prepped up beforehand. I would point out the numerous issues with the resurrection appearance. Oh, hold on a sec. Jorge is
Yeah.
here. Hello, Jorge. Good to see you, my friend.
Hey,
Howdy.
So yeah, we're kind of helping prepare for a kind of like a little discussion slash debate with Matt Slick from Carm.org.
Okay. Yeah, I can. I just hang out, help if I can. Who's doing the debating?
Me versus Slick.
Okay, gotcha. What's if you don't mind catching me up? What's the topic? I think I might know it, but
Probably just like naturalism, atheism, what is a better model or whatever.
yes, okay.
Yeah, sure. I already kind of went through and presented basically what I was going to say. I think I should expand on my opening arguments a little bit more. Dressa, what do you think?
How long is your opening statement allowed to be?
Like I try to want to keep it under like 8 to 10 minutes.
Okay. I'm not sure how long the presentation that you gave lasted because I was just listening to it. I wasn't paying attention to the time, but it sounded pretty succinct. So it sounds like you might have some room to add in some more material if you want to. But I think that it was good in that you came right off the bat with a specific argument against theism. And then you went from there and started talking about how naturalism is a better account of the world overall. So I thought it was pretty straight to the point. And I think it was good for that reason.
Yeah, and I might point out, like, okay, we have a model of how planets and stars form and show them how that forms and show them that it's completely contradictory to the way the Bible presents it. We have a model on how life develops over time and biodiversity. We have these models, they don't. So as far as the resurrection... what was
Go ahead.
That? So for the resurrection, I might say... I would probably point out the many contradictions within the resurrection narrative and point out that, of course, extraordinary claims require the extraordinary evidence. And I would probably point out the fact that Jesus never appeared to any of the Pharisees and any of the Romans who crucified him, which I think would be a pretty significant point. And
why would that be a significant point?
Well, hold on. Let me pull this up real quick. Hold on.
I'll throw this over.
Let's see here. Let's see here. Let's see here. Here we go. This is an actually pretty interesting article from Judaism Resources. Matthew admits that Jesus was never resurrected. There's an interesting verse in the book of Matthew. Let's see here. Okay. So yeah, here we go. Matthew accidentally reveals to the reader that his story about the Jewish leadership trying to hush up about the resurrection is a lie. The bribe itself shows that its story is a fabrication because the leadership acts on knowledge that they did not and could not have. And the issue here is Matthew 28:13. Let me pull this up in the NASB because that's what Matt Slick writes. Matthew 28. Here we go. Matthew 28. Okay, 13. Sorry. Here we go. Now, while they were on their way, some of the men from the guards came into the city and reported to the chief priest all that had happened. And when they had assembled with the elders and consulted together, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers and said, "You are to say, his disciples came at night and stole him while we are asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will appease him and keep you out of trouble." And they took the money and did as they had been instructed, and the story is widely spread among the Jews and is to this day. Lots of problems is that there's no source for the story. There's no source in the Talmud or in any other historical documents at that time. But the real problem here is that the bribe shows that this story is fabricated because the leadership acts with knowledge that they could not have had. So the problem is the leadership cannot at this point know what is going to happen. For all they know, Jesus is going to begin walking the streets of Jerusalem, healing people, preaching, and attracting an even larger following than he had before. He could show up at any moment and demand that they acknowledge him as the Messiah and that he fulfilled his predicted resurrection. So how is it that the fact that they bribed the guards to say that Jesus took his body, they do not know that Jesus would. The problem here, they do not know because they could not have known that Jesus would never show himself. The fact that Jesus never showed himself to the Pharisees and Pilate is a very good argument against the resurrection, um, along with all the numerous contradictions about the resurrection accounts.
So one way that that Slick might respond to that, because I've heard it before, is that the purpose of Jesus's appearance to the disciples was to give the Great Commission. He wasn't really showing up to confirm to the whole world that he had resurrected or anything like that. He specifically appeared to these particular people because he had a mission for them, and for no other reason than that.
Okay, so I would respond by saying, okay, but Paul claims that Jesus appeared to over 500 people. Who are they? We don't know, but that's what Paul claims. So Paul claims that Jesus appeared to over 500 people. Why couldn't he have appeared to the Pharisees and the people who crucified him? Plus, Jesus actually promised that he would appear to them.
Well, you're begging the question there, David. You're saying, why didn't Jesus do this thing that I think he should have done? And that's not really much of an argument.
Right. Well, hold on. Let me pull it up.
I think that the point that you made about him appearing to 500 people is a good rejoinder. The only thing I would say is that I mean, if he's up on his stuff, if he's following people like Gary Habermas and Mike Licona, the first thing he's going to do is he's going to take that verse and he's going to point out that we can locate the time period locate this verse in a time period that is only about 5 years removed from the crucifixion itself, based on Paul's own testimony. So what you get is this attestation for a resurrection appearance in Paul that you can go all the way up until just 5 years after the crucifixion. So how can you say, for example, that these are just legendary embellishments or anything like that, when we can actually bring this all the way up to just 5 years after it happened?
Well, I would point out that I trying to think a couple of things that might try and point out. That again, Jesus actually promises that that he would appear in the lifetimes of the Pharisees and in the lifetime of his followers within that generation, and that prophecy was not fulfilled. He might say that, okay, this verse really is talking about a whole race of people, but then I would say, okay, but there's no justification for that. There was no for how we should interpret that passage.
I guess I would also add, David, your argument for 28:13, I don't think it makes much sense given the entire chapter, because in the first 9-10 verses are about Jesus rising from the cave, and verse 10 says the gods, or verse 8, whatever, says the gods saw him and reported to their captain.
Right.
So I don't know how on 13, when they come back and say lie about him being taken away at the night, I don't see where the information be lacking.
Right. Well, the information is lacking because the Pharisees here act upon the knowledge the Pharisees here are assuming that Jesus would never appear to them or appear to Pilate or anyone else. And the problem being that Jesus could have appeared directly to them and said, okay, you're in trouble now, but he did not. Jesus only appeared to his followers and no one else. And I would additionally point out that Matthew has the crazy story of the Walking Dead that only Matthew seems to know about, and that even Mike Licona says that, okay, this is an embellishment and didn't really happen.
Yeah, and got fired for it.
I'm actually surprised he got fired for admitting the obvious.
Well, it's probably the confession of faith statement that you have to sign if you're going to teach at some of these colleges and seminaries and stuff. So just two things real quick. The first thing is that I vape And so if you are talking and you hear like the sound of my vape, just tell me so that way I'm not like interfering with your stream as I'm doing. And then
No, you're good.
okay, cool. And the second thing is to roll into another historical kind of argument that you would get from somebody like James Patrick Holding, which is the explosive, incredible growth of Christianity after Jesus. How can you explain the enormous success that Christianity had as a as a world religion, especially in the light of all of the hostility against it when it first started?
Well, then I would point out that other religions had the same thing happen to them and still flourished pretty nicely. For example, I would point out that Mormonism had the same thing. They were highly oppressed and forced to go all the way over into Utah, and and Joseph Smith himself was arrested and killed, and yet Mormonism, for all intents and purposes, flourished. So that is not a very good argument, because that is not a event that is unique to Christianity.
Okay. Another thing there would just be people like, well, I know Bart Ehrman does it, but there's this other fella, and I'm confusing him with Ronald Numbers right now, who is on a completely different thing. But there's this particular fella, it might be a couple of authors, and what they do is they specifically trace the growth of Christianity over the course of the first like 3 centuries or so, and what you actually get is a pretty natural growth pattern, from what I remember reading. And Bart Ehrman corroborates that in his own analysis in The Triumph of Christianity.
I think he's making a good point there. The creationists, the Christian, always make a grandiose statement like what they say is fact. Christianity exploded in popularity. Well, how you define exploded, right?
Right. So there's that. The other thing that I had in mind was, let me see here. So moving over to like something that William Lane Craig might say, and I have a doubt that Slick would use this particular argument, but I mean, this is all just kind of like mainstream resurrection apologetics. Craig argues that Joseph of Arimathea is unlikely to be a fictional character, and this points to a certain historical reliability in the story. Why would you make up a character as part of the Sanhedrin that actually did the right thing? Didn't the Christians have every motivation to paint the entire Sanhedrin as just villainous characters? Why get this weird detail about a member of the council doing the proper thing?
I would say that's exactly what we should expect, because that is because they're trying to say, kind of appeal to the authority. Okay, this guy is from the Sanhedrin himself. But then again, I would also point out that the Talmud makes no mention of a Joseph of Arimathea.
Well, you should make sure to get yourself ready for that. You can help me here, Dessel. The like argument of you want not going to embarrass your characters. What's that called?
Yeah.
The criteria of embarrassment.
Yeah, you should make sure that you have a good defense for that, because that comes up all the time.
Sure
Yeah.
does. So how would you respond to that one?
I would say that I agree that you're kind of echoing. So yeah, the criteria of embarrassment, I think, is a good way of determining what is fact and what is fiction in the biblical narrative accounts. I don't think that the entire Gospels are all fiction. Jesus definitely existed as a real person. Though, again, the criteria for embarrassment does help us determine what's true and what's not true.
Okay. I mean, like, again, you take whatever road you feel is best. I slightly differ on that. I don't think that the criterion of embarrassment is very good, and the reason why is because what embarrasses somebody is going to be highly dependent upon that particular person. For example, they give the example of female testimony,
Right?
but if the group,
I
okay, go ahead.
I actually have a very good response to that. I think I would say that if you're making up a story about the resurrection, that women is exactly what you were going to write. If you were a woman back in those days, it was the women that prepared the gym, and it was the women who prepared the spices and anointed the person's body. So again, that is exactly what we should expect. It'll be like me writing a story set in the 1950s, a murder story in a hotel. What character is going to find the body? Obviously, a woman, because a woman is more likely to be a maid in that time period than a man. So I would point out, women finding the body is not at any means an embarrassment to them.
Very well. The other thing I was going to point out is that, I mean, if the group that you're dealing with doesn't look upon women or other minority groups or anything like that, if they're not looking on them in the same way as the Orthodox view does, then you shouldn't expect them to feel embarrassed by mentioning it. And I don't think that Christianity was or could be considered an Orthodox view. They clearly take the position that the least shall come first. And so in that society, that's what the women will be lifted up. The whole question about the relationship between Jews and Gentiles, that whole distinction will start to break down and things like that. So whether or not that is going to count as something that's embarrassing is ultimately going to come down to who's speaking. And if the person who's speaking doesn't consider that embarrassing, then I don't think that the criterion for embarrassment is going to do a very good job in terms of getting you toward or bringing you to any kind of theory that's historically plausible.
Yeah. And
Still there?
yeah, I'm still there. I'm just reading. So yeah. Anything else that you might want to add that he might try and pin me down? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello? Hold on a second.
I can hear you.
Okay, you can hear me? That's good. I think Dressel dropped out.
Aw.
Oh well. Try Dressel, try coming back in. Okay, well, we definitely covered quite a lot.
Good.
Let's see here.
So this debate looks like it's going to be more of a theological debate than any particular hard science.
Yeah, more of a theological thing. Okay, Dressel's going to come back in a minute. Let's see here. Let's see here. Let's see here. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can. Sorry about that. My connection is terrible over here. So.
Oh, it's not a problem. Let's see here. I'm just reading a little bit. Let's see here. Let's see here.
After we're done with this bit on resurrection apologetics, I'll start hounding you about the cosmological argument.
Oh, fun. But yeah, I think we've covered enough for the resurrection. The sources are bad. The eyewitness testimony is not compelling, and so forth. There's simply no reason to believe the Gospels.
The last one I'm going to throw at you with respect to that is the question of martyrdom. Something that they say all the time is, why would these people die for something they knew would be a lie? They knew was a lie.
Okay, so here we go. There's a hidden assumption in that argument. The assumption here is that the Romans were nice people and that they would have allowed the disciples to live if they were if they would just say, okay, we were wrong. We know that the Romans were nasty people who would just kill people, regardless if they're innocent or guilty. So I would say, okay, of course they were going to be martyred. They were being killed. They are literally challenging the authority of Rome. I would also point out that other people have died for their lie, such as Joseph Smith. He died for his lie. I would also point out that the sources for their martyrdom is spurious and are later traditions. We simply don't know how these apostles actually died.
I think that's a good one there. You're assuming that since they died for their religion, when you don't have an account of them saying, I'm dying for my religion. They're just dead and we're saints. Those are two different things.
Exactly.
So there is one argument that he could bring against you. I'm not really sure whether or not he will, but when you take a look at the letter that Pliny writes to the emperor, it's circa 110 CE. The way that they talk about treating the Christians is to interrogate them, to demand that they basically renounce their religion, and if they do, you let them go.
That's true. That's true.
In terms of like this whole argument that it rests on the assumption that the Romans would let you go, there is some historical evidence that at the beginning of this, well, not the real beginning in the first century, but at the turn of the first into the second century, that we have a letter that explicitly does say that the Romans, insofar as the Christians would renounce their religion, that they wouldn't face any persecution.
Yeah, that is actually interesting. Yeah, I never heard that before. So I'm just looking at your Wikipedia page from Pliny the Younger on Christians. And Trajan's reply to Pliny overall gave 4 orders. Do not seek out the Christians for trial. If the accused are found guilty of being Christians, then they must be punished. If the accused deny that they are Christians and show proof that they are not by worshiping the gods, they must be pardoned. And anonymous accusations should not be considered.
So yeah, given that easy
so
rebuttal,
then I would also say that this is good evidence, actually, that the claims that the Romans went around persecuting Christians is false, at least initially, since they shouldn't be, as in Trajan's reply to Pliny, that they're not going to be going around hunting them down.
I guess I would also add, you can name literally any death cult from the past 100 years as an example of people who die for the belief.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Jonestown. The drink the Kool-Aid comes from Jonestown. So,
and the last thing that I would like to point out about Pliny's letter is that a lot of the time you'll hear people like Phil Fernandez, for example. He's made this point multiple times, where he uses Pliny's letter as evidence that Christianity was very well known and was exploding at the time. And when you actually read the letter, though, you find that he's saying exactly the opposite. Pliny is writing to the emperor because he has no idea about these Christians. He's barely even heard of them before. And the accounts that he's getting from Christians are that basically this cult had been dying out for some time, and it was only recently that they started to gain in numbers again. And because he's so unfamiliar with them, he's writing to the emperor for guidance.
Yeah. So yeah, that's actually a really good point. Yeah,
that goes to the previous thing you were talking about, which is the sudden explosion of Christianity.
Yep.
Yeah, but that's actually a really good argument against the sudden explosion of Christianity. But what really got Christianity going was Constantine in the 4th century that converted to Christianity.
Yeah.
I would say yes and no, because yes, in that he actually he really started to give them governmental support. But from what I remember reading about the growth of Christianity, they were already a sizable part of the population by the time Constantine comes around. You read somebody like Richard Carrier, for example, Not the Impossible Faith, and what he credits the rise of Christianity to was basically a grassroots movement. They went far and wide all along the Mediterranean, seeking out those who were poor, destitute. Many of the times they really tried to focus on converting women, and women played a major role in the early formation and growth of Christianity. So it was much more of a thing focused toward those at the bottom rung of the social ladder, and that's where Christianity grew.
Right, and then that might be a good point. Why were the women? Why did women find the tomb? Well, because they were appealing to women. They were their target audience for converts.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, like, you are likely to face a lot of opposition from somebody like Matt Slick on this point, because odds are he's more of a conservative fella, and so he might not like so much the idea of a kind of liberal view of Christianity. But my personal opinion is that if you take a look at early Christianity, there's no doubt that what you're dealing with is a much more progressively oriented viewpoint.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so that's some stuff about the resurrection. Maybe move over to the cosmological argument now. And the first one I'm going to throw at you is, if we follow the predictions of general relativity, we end up with a beginning to the universe. So why are you so anti-science?
Well, I'm not anti-science. I guess
I love the phrasing.
you're echoing. Yeah. Here I would try and ask Matt Slick, because he uses entropy sometimes. I would ask him, okay, Matt Slick, what is entropy? Can you define that for me? I would see if he actually knows what he's talking about.
All right, so yeah, basically like Dapper Dino tried to do to Mr. Batman in their last debate, ask him questions about entropy that he can't answer.
Yeah, like I didn't watch that debate because Mr. Batman is
Horrible.
Yeah, well, I mean, Mr. Batman goes a million miles an hour. He's kissing gallops all over the place.
So David, when they answer with that, well, that means things decay to nothingness. When they give that very non-science answer for entropy, what is your response?
Well, I would point out that number one, the Earth is a open system, and that we see order coming from disorder all the time, such as snowflakes. We see that planetary formation and star formation. So I would kind of press him, okay, what exactly is entropy? Can you define the units for it? How is it mathematically determined?
There's a really good account of, basically order arises thermodynamically. If you check out Neil Shank's book, God, the Devil, and Darwin. I don't know if you've read it, but if you haven't, he goes through basically the formation of a hurricane from a thermodynamic perspective. And it does a really good job at basically showing you the step-by-step way that the storm organizes from a thermodynamic perspective.
Okay, interesting. So thermodynamics order arises from disorder all the time.
Yeah, in open systems where energy is coming in. Yep.
Right, and the Earth is an open system getting in its energy from the sun.
Well, Dessel's original question was the universe, not the Earth.
Right. Well, we know the universe is an isolated system, not a closed system or an open system. So I'm not quite sure exactly the best line of attack for that. I might just quote from Dr. Sean Carroll's debate from William Lane Craig, and kind of reiterate and say what, quote verbatim, what Dr. Carroll said, because I think Dr. Carroll completely humiliated William Lane Craig in that debate.
I agree that Carroll won that debate. I thought that Craig still had a pretty pristine presentation, but overall, I would still grant the win to Carroll at the Greer Forum.
Yeah, William Lane Craig always uses the same arguments over and over again.
So, but Carroll's argument, though, when you're taking the second law of thermodynamics, like Bill Craig would do, or Matt Slick might do, and you applied it to the entire universe, your position is that the universe is an isolated system. and in that event, there is no influx of energy coming into the system. It would seem that it would run down. And so Carroll's response to that, though, is basically to say that because the laws of thermodynamics are statistically based, you do, in the long run, end up with situations where the second law of thermodynamics doesn't really apply. And then he points to particular laboratory experiments that have been done that essentially break the second law of thermodynamics. But the thing there is that you're going to get a lot of opposition in terms of, like, how firm the second law is. And he'll give you all sorts of different quotes from different scientists saying that if anything is sure in science, it's the second law of thermodynamics. And if you're going to rely on Carroll, this involves some kind of breaking with how thermodynamics usually works, based upon its statistical foundation.
Right. And then I would point out that, physical laws do break down on the quantum level. That's one of the problems that physics has, trying to piece together what actually happens with such a small level.
And I think that the same option for response is there with respect to general relativity, which is what we opened up this conversation with. General relativity, you follow the predictions, you end up at a singularity. But what cosmologists will tell you, including Christian cosmologists, is that you can't bring general relativity all the way to the singularity. It breaks down at a certain point. And so, for example, in the Cambridge Companion to Science and Religion, there is I believe he's a Jesuit cosmologist or some kind of Christian cosmologist, and he argues that the best way to interpret general relativity in terms of all of this is that at a certain point of temperature, you have to look at general relativity simply as conveying the past limit and not really the beginning of the universe, because it breaks down.
Right. So, Immutable, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, what's going on? Just got off from the Rages stream. That was interesting.
That was a thing, yeah.
That was a good show the whole time. But correct me if I'm wrong, and Orge probably knows better than I do, but the second law only applies also to systems that eventually reach equilibria, doesn't it?
Right.
Yeah, it's used in that context. The classic example is put a hot thing of water and cold water. Eventually, they hit the same level. So
right.
It's the like taking a sentence in science and making it this like huge, grandiose novel that Christians love to do so much. Well, people love to do so much. Jesus Christ.
The best thing you can do in going against entropy, if he goes after like planetary formation and accretion theory, is that the Earth itself is an open system. It's not
right.
It's not closed by any means.
So I guess a couple last things about the cosmological argument, and after everybody wraps up on that topic, I'll start hounding you on arguments to design. With respect to the cosmological argument, the Kalam argument in particular, would you deny that everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence?
Yes. They're called quantum fluctuations.
Okay.
So on that note, something I've been asking people about for the lawgiver argument is these suppositions require A to be true, B to be true in order for C to be true. But you need to prove something to be true. You can't just show that it's likely. Otherwise, then C is just likely, right? So what Dessel, is that how do I pronounce that?
Yeah, Dessel.
So when Dessel says, does everything that has a beginning, or however you phrased it, sorry, you can't just keep giving examples of things that needed a beginning for evidence. You need to prove it true by definition of the laws of logic. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. So perhaps I'll just put verbatim for what Dr. Sean Carroll says, that the problem with this premise is that it is false. But there's an even bigger problem, is that it's not even false. The real problem is that there are not the right vocabulary words to be using when we discuss fundamental physics and cosmology. This kind of Aristotelian analysis of causation was the cutting us stuff 2,500 years ago. Today, we know better. Our metaphysics must follow our physics. That's what the word metaphysics means. And in modern physics, when you open up a quantum field theory textbook or a general relativity textbook, you will not find the words transcendent cause anywhere. What you do find are differential equations. This reflects the fact that the way physics is known to work these days is in terms of patterns, unbreakable rules, laws of nature. Given the world at one point in time, we will tell you what happens next. There is no need for any extra metaphysical baggage like a transcendent cause on top of it. And it's precisely the wrong way to think about how the fundamental reality works. The question you should be asking is, what is the best model of the universe that science cannot up with? By model, I mean a formal mathematical system that proves to match up what we observe. So if you want to know whether something is possible in cosmology or physics, you ask, can I build a model? Can I build a model where the universe had a beginning but does not have a cause? The answer is yes, it's done. 30 years ago, very famously, Stephen Hawking and Jim Hartle presented the no boundary quantum cosmology model. The point about this model is not that it is the right model. I don't think that we're anywhere near the right model yet. The point is that it is completely self-contained. It is entire history of the universe that does not rely on anything outside it, just like that. The demand for the demand for a more than complete and consistent model that fits the data is a relic of the pre-scientific view of the world. My claim is that if you had a perfect cosmological model that accounted for the data you see, you would just go home and declare yourself having been victorious. You might also ask, could the universe be eternal? The answer to that question is yes, just to build a model. This is my favorite model. It's actually not a model that I think is correct. Once again, it's a model that I helped create, but it's about the search for models, not about saying any one model is the right idea. We hope that we get there someday, but we don't claim that we're there yet. So whether or not the universe can be eternal or not does not come down to a conversation about abstract principles. It comes down to a conversation about building models and seeing which one provides the best account for what do we see in the universe to be doing.
This is a digression, but I do have some problems with that personally. And I'm just going to say what they are really quickly, and we don't have to take much time on them. But the first thing is that the idea that you have quantum fluctuations that are causeless, ultimately that's going to depend on what kind of interpretation you're giving to quantum mechanics. You've got Bohmian mechanics, pilot wave mechanics, many different kinds of causal approaches to quantum mechanics. So I'm not really sure we can say as a matter of fact that we have observed causeless beginnings, because whether or not that's going to be true is going to depend on your interpretation of the theory, and we don't have an established interpretation yet. The second thing that I would...
No. That's so the issue there is that it's not talking about mechanistically. It's talking about in terms of... So, like when you have a wave function, for instance, what is certain about the wave function, always certain about the wave function, is that it is quantized, is that there are discrete states which are available to that system in terms of how it can be quantized and in what probabilities. It's not saying anything about something causing them. That's where the interpretations of quantum mechanics comes in.
Right.
But every theory will agree upon that there are, if you provide me some wave function, I will in return give you some set of probabilities that correspond to some states that particle or some quantum object can occupy.
Yeah, I have no problem with that at all. But I mean, like, if we're going to use quantum fluctuations as like empirically observed events where they are causeless, where they begin and they also are not caused, I think that involves interpretation of what quantum mechanics ultimately is. And since we don't have that interpretation established yet, I'm not quite sure that we can say that. I have no problem with the idea that, you use the wave function, you determine probabilities. All of that is just standard quantum mechanics and how it works. But okay, go ahead.
Let me argue it in this way in that case, right? To say, so I mean, let's say you're using Bohmian mechanics. Not to say that you are, but if you were, for instance, right? Bohmian mechanics has been tried and tried again, and there, just in short, that there isn't anything that really comports with it. There aren't mechanisms that work, but the more important aspect of it, right, is that the structure of quantum mechanics, like the notion of superposition, and that a sum of solutions is itself a new solution to the to some set of boundary conditions you impose on it.
Yes.
To me, at least, inherently says something about probabilistic nature, right? It would be the structure of quantum mechanics.
Hey, can I interrupt you guys real quick for 2 seconds?
Sure.
Yeah, we got to keep in mind here, we're supposed to be helping Neff
I know.
do debate prep, and I think quantum is over his head for sure, and to be honest, probably over everyone else.
Let me finish in this way then, right?
I apologize. I apologize for introducing the digression. I knew I was open.
Not a problem.
I know. I'll end it with this much.
It's fascinating stuff, but it's still way over my head.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let me end that conversation by saying this much at least. Is that for any like set of assumptions or like potential new theories that may come along or interpretations for that matter, whatever you want to call it, right? There would have to be evidence positively indicative of that thing, right? In this case, we're talking about quantum mechanics being somehow that there's a causative force in how what we perceive as random effects are produced. And so far, we don't have evidence of that.
I will. I do have some things that I would say, but I'm not going to for the moment, just for the purposes of our conversation here. I will give one more objection, though, to what David Neff said in terms of his quoting Carroll, because when Carroll was talking about you take a look at modern day physics and you don't find any discussion of causes. What you do find are differential equations. And I don't think that that's a very good response, because when you're building these models, what you're looking for are mechanisms, and mechanisms are causes. And you don't have to, like Craig pointed out in that debate, you don't have to take like an Aristotelian old world notion of causality. You can have whatever account of causality you want. But when we are building these models, we are looking for mechanisms that can explain a transition from state A to state B, and so on. And how are we going to understand these mechanisms if they're not causal?
Right. And these are immutable. And Joseph, what would be the best way to respond to, say, the Coulomb cosmological arguments?
I mean, the easiest way is to say that the universe didn't begin to exist.
Right.
My personal opinion is in line with that. I think that ultimately, when you're dealing with the physical, with the material dimension, or whatever it is that you want to call it, I think that it is ultimately eternal.
Yeah.
Sorry, did you agree with me, or what was your?
If you were saying that the universe, as far as it goes, you don't think it had a beginning, that it was in some sense eternal, I agree with that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we agree in that case.
Yeah, I think that bounces off the point of you need to prove a supposition A and B of the cosmological argument in order for C to be true. If you can make an argument like they're saying for A being wrong, well, then you have an issue there, right?
Right.
And you can always throw it back at them and say, hey, can you show that these things are true? Or are you just showing that you think they're likely? Because just I think it's likely, well, therefore it's not true then.
Yeah, that's incredulity.
Exactly.
I think most creationist arguments always boil down to some form of incredulity.
Yeah, but it's pointless to just say that. You want to try to represent that, right? You can't just yell incredulity and have that be your argument.
I agree with that. You don't want to hand wavy or dismissive. You want to engage.
Makes for a boring debate too.
Yeah.
The only thing that would, I'm not sure. Again, it's been like 10 years since I've listened to Matt Slick. But if you're going to go with an eternal universe option, then you'll end up with all of the paradoxes about infinity that you have to deal with, like Hilbert's Hotel and Tristan Shandy's paradox and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Anyway, guys, I want to really thank you guys so much for your help. I will. Hopefully, the debate will happen tomorrow, but if not, I will keep you guys informed. Dressel, do you have my email?
I don't think I do.
What
All right.
channel's the debate on?
Well, I'm not sure yet. It was supposed to be on Striving for Eternity's channel, but
Ah.
there's conflict tomorrow with another thing going on with their channel. So it's just going to be a wait and see thing. It might not happen tomorrow. That was the original plan, but I definitely don't know. But this will be a good way. This has definitely been a very helpful way to prepare for my next encounter with Mr. Slick.
All right, man.
Yeah,
Do it to him.
Slick tends to goddamn, can't speak today. Slick tends to be a fan of presuppositional apologetics. He's usually, from what I understand, not usually too prone on evidentialism.
Yeah. Anyway, I gotta get going.
Yeah, take
Me
care,
too,
Neff.